The crystal chandelier cast fractured rainbows across the marble floor, each shard of light dancing like the broken pieces of Zephyra Nightingale's heart. She stood in the grand foyer of the Christian mansion, her bare feet cold against the pristine stone, clutching the pregnancy test that had just changed everything. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, growing wider with each passing second. Hannah Christian's reflection multiplied in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors that lined the walls, creating an army of condemning stares. His perfectly tailored suit hung on his broad shoulders like armor, but his eyes, those deep brown eyes that had once looked at her with something resembling love, now burned with accusation. "You planned this." His voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. "You think a baby will trap me into staying with someone like you?" Zephyra's fingers tightened around the small plastic stick, the positive sign blurring through her tears. "Hannah, please, don't." He held up a hand, the massive wedding ring catching the light. "Don't you dare try to manipulate me with tears. I should have known this was coming. Should have seen the signs." The words hit her like physical blows. She had walked into this mansion believing in fairy tales, believing that love could bridge any gap, racial, economic, social. Now she stood in the ruins of that dream, understanding with crystal clarity that some castles were built on quicksand, and some princes were just men who had forgotten how to love. "I didn't plan anything," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast space. "This is our baby, Hannah, our child." He laughed, the sound harsh and bitter, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Our child? There is no our anymore, Zephyra. There never really was there? You've been playing a long game since the day you walked through those doors." The accusation stole her breath. She thought of their wedding day, of the promises whispered in the darkness of their bedroom, of the mornings when he'd held her close and called her his salvation. Had it all been a lie? Had she been so blind? "That's not true," she said, finding strength in her voice. "You know that's not true. I loved you. I still love you. Love?" He turned away from her, staring out the massive windows at the manicured gardens beyond. "What you call love, I call desperation. What you call devotion, I call calculation. You saw an opportunity and you took it." Zephyra took a step toward him, her hand reaching out.
"Hannah, look at me."
"Really look at me. When have I ever asked you for anything? When have I ever tried to trap you? All I ever wanted was your love." He spun around, his face contorted with rage. "And now you want my child. Now you want to tie yourself to me forever with this." He gestured at her stomach with disgust. "This mistake." The word hit her like a physical blow. Mistake. Their child, the tiny life growing inside her, was a mistake. She pressed her hand to her still flat belly, protective and fierce. "Don't call our baby that," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Don't you ever call our child a mistake." "It is a mistake," he shot back. "The biggest mistake I've ever made was believing you were different, believing you actually cared about me and not what I could give you." The injustice of it overwhelmed her. She thought of all the charity events she'd attended at his side, enduring the whispered comments and pointed stares, the way she'd smiled and nodded when his friends made jokes about his exotic taste, the nights she'd lain awake wondering if she was enough, if she would ever be enough. "What could you give me?" she asked, her voice rising. "Your name? Your money? Your family's acceptance? Because I never got any of those things, did I? Your mother still introduces me as Hannah's friend at parties. Your father has never said more than 10 words to me. Your money sits in accounts I can't even access. So tell me, Hannah, what exactly was I supposed to be trapping you for?" His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching beneath the skin. "You got this house. You got the lifestyle. You got to play at being something you're not." The cruelty of his words took her breath away. Play at being something she wasn't. She thought of all the ways she'd tried to fit into his world, the etiquette classes she'd taken, the way she'd changed her speech, her clothes, her very essence to become what she thought he wanted. "And what am I, Hannah?" she asked quietly. "Tell me what I really am." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or recognition of the line he was about to cross. But then his face hardened again. You're a woman who thought she could use her body to buy a life she never earned." The silence that followed was deafening. Zafira felt something inside her chest crack, not her heart, that had shattered the moment he'd called their child a mistake. This was deeper. This was the sound of her spirit learning to stand alone. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin with a dignity that came from somewhere deep inside her. "I see," she said softly. "And what does that make you?" "A man who married a woman he despises? A man who spent our entire marriage lying to someone he considers beneath him?" For the first time since she'd shown him the test, uncertainty flickered across his features. "But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. It makes me a man who knows when he's been played," he said coldly. Zephyra nodded slowly, pieces falling into place with painful clarity. She thought of her grandmother's words, spoken on her deathbed. "Baby girl, never beg a man to love you. A man who has to be convinced isn't worth convincing." "I choose life," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I choose our baby," his face twisted with fury. "Then you choose poverty. You choose struggle. You choose to raise that child in the gutter where you belong." The words should have destroyed her. Instead, they crystallized something inside her, a strength she'd forgotten she possessed. She looked around the marble foyer, at the crystal chandelier, at the gilt-framed mirrors that had reflected her image during their marriage. None of it had ever really been hers. None of it had ever really mattered. "I choose love," she said simply. "I choose to love this child the way you should have loved me, unconditionally, completely, without reservation." She turned toward the grand staircase, intending to pack the few things that were truly hers. But his voice stopped her. "If you walk up those stairs, Zephyra, if you pack your bags and leave, you're never coming back. There's no changing your mind, no coming back when reality hits and you realize what you're giving up." She paused on the first step, her hand resting on the ornate banister. For a moment she imagined begging, imagined falling to her knees and promising to end the pregnancy, promising to be whatever he wanted her to be. But then she felt it, the faintest flutter in her belly, like butterfly wings against her soul. "I know," she said without turning around. "I'm counting on it." As she climbed the stairs, she heard him call her name once, his voice cracking slightly, but she didn't turn back. Behind her, the chandelier continued its eternal dance, casting rainbows on empty marble, illuminating a space that would never again hold anything resembling love. At the top of the stairs, she paused and looked back one last time. Hannah stood alone in the vast foyer, looking smaller somehow, diminished by his own cruelty. And in that moment, Zephyra Nightingale knew with absolute certainty that she was walking away from the biggest mistake of her life, not the pregnancy, but the man who couldn't see the gift he was throwing away. The bedroom that had once been their sanctuary now felt foreign and cold. She moved through it like a ghost, gathering the few possessions that had been hers before the marriage. Photographs of her family, books that had comforted her through lonely nights, jewelry her grandmother had given her. Everything else belonged to the life she was leaving behind. Her suitcase was small, pitifully small, to contain the remnants of what had been her entire world. But as she folded each item carefully inside, she felt lighter with every decision. This dress, too expensive, chosen to impress people who would never accept her. These shoes, painful and impractical, designed for a woman who never walked anywhere meaningful. This jewelry, cold and flashy, symbols of wealth rather than love. She kept only what had meaning, what connected her to the woman she had been before she'd lost herself in the maze of Hannah's expectations. The simple cross her grandmother had worn to church every Sunday. The university sweatshirt that reminded her she had once been ambitious for herself, not just for someone else's approval. The worn copy of poetry that had sustained her through other dark times. The wedding dress hung in the closet like a beautiful lie, all silk and lace and broken promises. She left it there, along with everything else that had been costume rather than truth. As she descended the stairs for the final time, Hannah was nowhere to be seen. The mansion felt empty, as if it had already forgotten her presence. Perhaps it had never truly acknowledged it in the first place. She set her suitcase by the front door and took one. Last look around the foyer that had witnessed her transformation. From hopeful bride to discarded wife, the mirrors reflected her image back endlessly. A woman carrying a small suitcase and an enormous burden of disappointment. But also a woman whose spine was straight, whose chin was lifted, whose eyes held a spark that hadn't been there when she'd first walked through these doors. The silence was complete as she opened the front door. No protest from Hannah, no last-minute pleas or apologies. He had meant every word he'd said. The choice he'd given her wasn't really a choice at all. It was an execution disguised as an option. The autumn air was sharp against her skin as she stepped outside, carrying nothing but her single suitcase and the life growing inside her. Behind her, the mansion's windows glowed warmly, but the warmth was an illusion. There was nothing warm about a place where love was conditional, where acceptance came with terms and conditions that could be revoked without notice. She walked down the long driveway toward the street, her footsteps echoing against the silence. Each step took her further from the woman she had been, dependent, desperate for approval, willing to diminish herself for the promise of belonging. And each step brought her closer to someone she didn't yet know, but was eager to discover. A woman who could stand alone, who could choose love over comfort, who could build something real from nothing but determination and hope. At the end of the driveway, she turned back for one final look. The mansion sat like a beautiful tomb against the darkening sky, all its windows glowing but empty of life. Somewhere inside, Hannah was probably already convincing himself that he'd made the right choice, that he'd narrowly escaped a trap rather than destroyed a gift. Let him believe what he needed to believe. She had more important work to do now, the work of becoming the mother her child deserved, the work of proving that love didn't require luxury to flourish, the work of building a life that would never again depend on someone else's approval. The street beyond the gates was full of possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. All she knew for certain was that whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the fierce protectiveness that was already growing inside her alongside their child. And that would be enough. More than enough. It would be everything. Chapter 2. The Ultimatum. Some choices revealed the true nature of a person's soul. His revealed a wasteland where love should have bloomed. The bedroom that had once been their sanctuary now felt like a courtroom, where Zephira sat as both defendant and evidence of her own supposed crimes. The silk sheets they had shared lay rumpled beneath her, witness to countless nights of whispered promises that had evaporated like morning dew. The pregnancy test sat on the mahogany nightstand between them, its positive result glowing like an accusation in the soft lamplight. Hannah paced the length of their bedroom like a caged predator, his expensive leather shoes silent against the plush Persian carpet. Each step measured and deliberate, each turn sharp with barely contained fury. The walls seemed to close in with every pass he made, the air growing thicker with unspoken threats. "All this time," he muttered, running his hands through his dark hair, "all this time I've given you everything. This house, this life, this name. And this is how you repay me?" Zephira pulled her silk robe tighter around her body, seeking warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "Repay you? Hannah, I'm your wife, not your employee. Love isn't a transaction." He stopped pacing and fixed her with a stare that could have frozen flame. "Isn't it? Everything in this world is a transaction, Zephira. I gave you status, security, a place in society that you could never have achieved on your own. And in return, I expected loyalty, discretion, not this calculated attempt to permanentize what was always supposed to be temporary." The words hit her like ice water. "Temporary? Our marriage was temporary. Everything is temporary," he said with chilling calm. "But some things end naturally, and others require intervention." She stood from the bed, her legs unsteady but her resolve growing stronger. "What are you saying, Hannah? I'm saying you have a choice to make. He moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the garden, his back to her. A simple choice that will determine the rest of your life. The moonlight streaming through the glass cast him in silver and shadow, making him look like a stranger. Perhaps he always had been. I'm listening, she said, though every instinct screamed at her to run. He turned slowly, his face carved from stone. End this pregnancy, and we can go back to the way things were. Continue this charade of domestic bliss, if that's what makes you happy. I'll even increase your allowance, give you access to the offshore accounts. Consider it compensation for your discomfort. Zephyr's hand moved instinctively to her stomach. And if I don't? Then you pack your bags and disappear from my life forever. No settlement. No alimony. No access to the Christian name or fortune. You'll leave with nothing but the clothes on your back and whatever pride you think you're protecting. The ultimatum hung in the air between them, like a blade suspended by the thinnest thread. Zephyra felt the world shift beneath her feet, reality rearranging itself into something unrecognizable. You can't be serious, she whispered. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. He moved closer, and she could see the cold calculation in his eyes. You want to keep that child? Fine, but you'll do it without me, without my name, and without a single penny of my money. You'll do it in whatever hovel you can afford, on whatever menial job you can find. This is your child too, she said, her voice breaking. Your flesh and blood, is it? He tilted his head, considering her as if she were a puzzle he was solving. How can I be sure? You've proven quite adept at deception, haven't you? Playing the loving wife while plotting this trap. The accusation stole her breath. In their entire marriage, she had never so much as looked at another man. Her world had revolved around him completely, utterly, to the point where she'd lost herself in the process. You know that's not true, she said, tears streaming down her face. You know I've never been with anyone else. You know this baby is yours. I know nothing about you anymore, he said with devastating finality. The woman I married would never have tried to trap me like this. The woman I married understood her place. My place? The words came out like broken glass. And what place is that, Hannah? Beneath you, in your shadow, grateful for whatever scraps of attention you throw my way. His smile was cruel. Exactly. The honesty of it was more devastating than any lie could have been. For their entire marriage, she had wondered why she never felt truly accepted by his family. Why his friends treated her like an exotic pet. Why she always felt like she was auditioning for a role she'd already been cast in. Now she knew. I see, she said quietly. And our child? What place would our child have in your world? There is no our child, he said firmly. There is a choice. My life continues as planned, with or without you. But it will not be derailed by an unwanted pregnancy. Unwanted, she repeated, tasting the bitterness of the word. Our baby is unwanted, completely, he confirmed without hesitation. I have plans, Zephyrah. Goals that don't include changing diapers or attending school plays or pretending to be a family man. I never wanted children, and I certainly never wanted them with someone like you. The cruelty was breathtaking in its clarity. She thought of all the times she'd mentioned children, how he'd always changed the subject or deflected with kisses and promises of someday. She'd thought he was being romantic, waiting for the perfect moment. Now she understood he'd been buying time, hoping she'd never push the issue. Someone like me, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. Tell me, Hannah, what kind of someone am I? He studied her for a long moment, and she saw him weighing his words, deciding how much truth she could handle. You're beautiful, he said finally. Exotic, passionate. You've been a delightful diversion from the expectations of my world. But diversions end, Zephyrah. They're not meant to become permanent fixtures. A diversion, she repeated, the word echoing in the silence. Our entire marriage, and I've been a diversion. An expensive one, he added with casual cruelty. But worthwhile until now. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the weight of revelation crushing down on her. Everything made sense now. The way his family treated her, the way his friends spoke to her, the way he introduced her at social functions. She wasn't his wife. She was his acquisition. His temporary indulgence? The prenup, she said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. That's why you insisted on such harsh terms. You always planned for this to end. I planned for every contingency, he confirmed. It's what successful men do. And our baby. Our child is just another contingency you're planning for? There is no child, he said with icy finality. There's a mistake that needs to be corrected. A problem that needs to be solved. And I'm offering you the solution. Zephira stood slowly, her hand pressed protectively over her stomach. In the space of one conversation, her entire world had crumbled. The man she'd loved with every fiber of her being had revealed himself to be a stranger. The home she'd thought they'd built together was nothing but an elaborate stage set. And if I choose our baby, she asked quietly, then you choose poverty, he said without emotion. You choose struggle. You choose to raise a bastard child in whatever slum you can afford. You choose to explain to that child why their father wanted nothing to do with them. The words were designed to break her, to drive her to her knees in submission. But something strange was happening inside Zephira's chest. Instead of breaking, she felt something else, something fierce and protective and unbreakable. I choose life, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I choose love. I choose to give this child what you're incapable of giving, unconditional acceptance. His face darkened with rage. Then you choose to destroy yourself for the sake of genetic material that will amount to nothing. That child will grow up knowing they were unwanted by their father. They'll grow up in poverty, struggling for every scrap of dignity you think you're protecting. They'll grow up knowing their mother chose them over everything else, she countered. They'll grow up knowing what real love looks like. Love? He laughed bitterly. Is that what you call this? Condemning an innocent child to a life of hardship because of your stubborn pride. I call it giving my child something you'll never understand, she said, moving toward the walk-in closet. I call it choosing what's right over what's easy. As her hands closed around the suitcase handle, she heard his voice behind her, cold and final as a judge's gavel. When you're working multiple jobs to keep a roof over that child's head, remember this moment, Zephira. Remember that you chose this struggle. And when that child asks why their father abandoned them, tell them the truth. Tell them their mother's pride was more important than their future. But Zephira was already moving, already packing, already choosing a future that would be difficult but honest, challenging but real. She had spent too long trying to fit into a world that would never truly accept her. Now she would build a world where her child would never have to question their worth. The suitcase lay open on the bed like a promise of freedom, waiting to be filled with the remnants of her old life and the tools she would need to build a new one. Behind her, Hannah continued his litany of threats and predictions, but his words had lost their power to hurt her. She was choosing love. She was choosing life. She was choosing to become the mother her child deserved, even if it meant walking away from everything she had once thought she wanted. And for the first time since seeing those 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test, Zephira Nightingale felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Chapter 3. Walking into the storm. Freedom tastes like tears and possibility, bitter and sweet in equal measure. The massive front door of the Christian mansion closed behind Zephira with a finality that echoed through her bones like the tolling of a funeral bell. She stood on the marble steps clutching a single suitcase, the only remnant of her former life that truly belonged to her. Everything else, the designer clothes, the jewelry, the life she'd built, had been borrowed, temporary, as illusory as morning mist. The autumn air bit through her thin coat, reminding her that she no longer had the luxury of climate-controlled comfort. The wind carried the scent of dying leaves and distant rain, nature's honest acknowledgement that some things must end for others to begin. She pulled her collar tighter and descended the steps one by one, each footfall taking her further from the woman she'd been and closer to someone she'd yet to discover. Behind her, the mansion loomed like a beautiful prison she'd escaped, its windows glowing warmly against the gathering dusk. She didn't look back. Looking back was a luxury she could no longer afford. The city streets stretched before her like uncharted territory. During her marriage, she'd traveled these same roads in the back of luxury cars, insulated from the reality of the world beyond tinted windows. Now she walked among the commuters and laborers, the students and dreamers, all of them moving with purpose toward destinations she couldn't imagine. Her first night was spent in a roadside motel that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. The room was small and stark, with water-stained walls and a heater that rattled like old bones. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her hand pressed to her still, flat stomach, and spoke to the life growing inside her for the first time. "It's just us now. Little one," she whispered into the silence, "but we're going to be okay. I promise you that." The words felt like a prayer and a battle cry combined. She had no idea how she would keep such a promise, but she knew with absolute certainty that she would. Morning brought harsh fluorescent light and the reality of her situation. Her savings account, the small one Hannah had allowed her to maintain for personal expenses, contained barely enough for a week in the motel. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed in a haze of love and trust had stripped her of any claim to his fortune. She was, quite literally, starting from nothing. The employment office was a study in institutional beige, filled with plastic chairs and the desperate energy of people seeking second chances. Zephira sat among them, her designer handbag incongruous among the worn belongings of her fellow job seekers. She'd sold her wedding ring that morning to a pawn shop owner who'd barely looked up from his newspaper, treating the symbol of her former life like any other piece of merchandise. "Zephira Nightingale?" The caseworker's voice cut through her reverie. "Yes, that's me." The woman behind the desk looked tired, worn down by too many stories of hardship and too few happy endings. "What kind of work experience do you have?" It was a simple question that revealed the complexity of her situation. What could she say? That she'd been a professional wife? That her job had been looking beautiful at charity events and smiling gracefully at dinner parties? That her greatest skill was pretending to belong in a world that had never wanted her? "I have a college degree in literature," she said finally, "and I've organized several charity events." The caseworker's expression softened slightly. "Volunteer work?" "Yes, mostly volunteer work." "Any retail experience? Food service? Cleaning?" Each question was a small humiliation, a reminder of how completely unprepared she was for this new reality. "No, but I'm willing to learn. I'm a hard worker, and I need a job." The desperation in her voice must have been evident, because the caseworker's expression softened further. "There's a cleaning company that's hiring. Night shift, office buildings downtown. It's hard work, but they don't require experience." Zephira nodded quickly. "I'll take it. The pay is minimum wage, and you'll need to buy your own supplies. Are you sure you're up for this? It's physical work, and..." She glanced at Zephira's obviously expensive clothes. "It might be different from what you're used to." "Different is exactly what I need," Zephira said firmly. That evening, she stood in the supply closet of the Meridian office complex, learning to operate an industrial vacuum cleaner from Rosa Martinez, a weathered woman with kind eyes and calloused hands. "First thing you learn," Rosa said, her accent thick with the wisdom of experience, "is that there's dignity in honest work. Don't matter what these fancy people think of us. We're the ones keeping their world clean so they can play their important games." Zephira nodded, grateful for the wisdom and the lack of judgment. Rosa didn't ask questions about how a woman with manicured nails and designer shoes had ended up pushing a mop cart through corporate hallways. The work was harder than anything Zephira had ever imagined. Her soft hands blistered within hours. Her back ached from bending and lifting. Her feet, accustomed to comfortable flats and cushioned heels, screamed in protest against the cheap work boots she'd bought at a discount store. But as the night progressed, something unexpected happened. With each floor she cleaned, each window she wiped clear, she felt lighter, freer. The weight of maintaining an image, of being the perfect wife, of constantly monitoring her words and actions, all of it fell away. replaced by the simple satisfaction of work honestly done. During her break, she sat on the steps of the office building and called her sister Celeste for the first time since leaving the mansion. "Zephyra, girl, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you." The familiar warmth of her sister's voice brought tears to her eyes. She'd lost so many relationships during her marriage, friendships that had withered under the weight of her new social obligations and the subtle disapproval of Hannah's circle. "I left him, Celeste. I left Hannah." Silence stretched across the phone line, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "What happened? Did he hurt you?" "Not the way you mean," Zephyra said carefully. "But yes, he hurt me. He hurt us." "Us?" Zephyra closed her eyes, preparing to speak the truth that would change everything. "I'm pregnant, Celeste. And when I told him, he demanded I choose between the baby and him." Another silence, longer this time. "Then that bastard, that absolute bastard. Where are you?" "I'm coming to get you right now." "No," Zephyra said quickly. "I need to do this on my own. I need to prove that I can." "Prove what to who?" "Zeph, you don't have anything to prove to anybody." "I have everything to prove to this baby," she said, her hand moving to her stomach. "I need to show my child that their mother is strong enough to choose them over everything else. That I'm strong enough to build a life worth living." "You are strong enough," Celeste said fiercely. "You've always been strong enough. That man just made you forget." When the call ended, Zephyra sat in the quiet darkness, surrounded by the city's nighttime symphony of distant traffic and late-night voices. For the first time in her marriage, she felt completely alone and completely herself. She returned to work with renewed energy, tackling each task with methodical precision. As dawn approached and the early commuters began arriving, she gathered her supplies and prepared to leave. Tomorrow night she would return. And the night after that, however long it took to build a foundation for the life she and her child deserved. In the lobby mirror, she caught sight of her reflection, hair escaping from its ponytail, face flushed from exertion, clothes wrinkled and practical. She looked nothing like the polished society wife who had posed for photos just days before. She looked tired and determined and absolutely real. "We did it," she whispered to her belly. "Day one, and we survived." As she walked toward the bus stop in the growing light of dawn, Zephyra felt something she hadn't experienced during her marriage: pride in herself. Not in her appearance or her connections or her ability to charm a room, but in her willingness to work, to struggle, to choose love over luxury. The bus arrived with a wheeze of brakes and a cloud of exhaust. As she climbed aboard, finding a seat among the early morning workers and night shift employees heading home, she realized she was exactly where she belonged, among people who understood that dignity came not from what you owned, but from what you were willing to sacrifice for the ones you loved. The city rushed past the window as the bus carried her toward an uncertain future. But for the first time since seeing those 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test, Zephyra Nightingale smiled. The storm she'd walked into was fierce and unforgiving, but she was discovering that she was fiercer still. The small apartment she found was barely more than a room with a kitchenette, but it was hers, paid for with money she'd earned herself, furnished with pieces she'd chosen from thrift stores and second-hand shops. Every stick of furniture, every dish in the tiny cupboard, every piece of clothing hanging in the narrow closet represented independence earned through sweat and determination. She stood in the center of her new home, surrounded by the modest possessions that constituted her entire world, and felt something she'd never experienced in the mansion: complete ownership. This space belonged to her, not because someone had given it to her, but because she had earned it. In the corner, she'd set aside space for a crib that she would buy when she could afford it. For now, it was just an empty corner full of possibility, waiting for the child who would never question their place in the world because their mother had claimed that place through honest work and fierce love. The reflection in her bathroom mirror showed a woman transformed. Gone was the pampered socialite with professionally maintained everything. In her place stood someone with calloused hands and tired eyes and an unbreakable spirit. Someone who had learned that strength didn't come from what others gave you, but from what you were willing to give up for what mattered most. "We're home, baby," she said to her belly, her hand resting protectively over the life growing inside her. "We're finally home." Outside her window, the city hummed with the quiet energy of people pursuing their own dreams and survival. But inside her small apartment, Zephyra Nightingale had already found both. She'd walked into the storm of uncertainty and emerged with something more valuable than all of Hannah's wealth combined: the knowledge that she was strong enough to protect the life she'd chosen, no matter what the world threw at her. The storm was far from over, but she was no longer afraid of it. She was part of it now, and it was part of her. And together, she and her child would weather whatever came next. Chapter 4. The Months of Silence. Strength isn't born in comfort. It's forged in the furnace of necessity, tempered by tears and sharpened by the fierce love of a mother's heart. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the pre-dawn darkness of Zephyra's studio apartment, just as it had every day since she'd begun this new life. She silenced it with a practiced swipe, her movements careful and deliberate to avoid waking Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman in the paper-thin walled apartment next door, who had become both neighbor and unlikely guardian angel. The reflection that greeted her in the cracked bathroom mirror told the story of her transformation. Gone was the pampered socialite with professionally maintained skin and weekly salon appointments. In her place stood a woman whose hands bore the calluses of honest work, whose face had been carved leaner by careful budgeting and calculated hunger, whose eyes held a depth that only comes from staring into the abyss and choosing to climb out rather than fall. Her growing belly pressed against the bathroom sink as she brushed her teeth with methodical efficiency. The morning sickness had passed, replaced by a constant gnawing hunger that she satisfied as sparingly as possible. Every dollar mattered now. Every meal was calculated against the needs of the life growing inside her and the demands of the small savings account that would need to stretch through maternity leave. The coffee shop where she worked buzzed with the familiar rhythm of pre-work caffeine addiction. Zephyra had learned to move through the space like a dancer, her pregnant body adapting to the demands of steaming milk, pulling shots, and managing the endless stream of customers who saw her only as the mechanism that delivered their daily fix. "Double shot. Oat milk, extra hot, no foam," she called out, sliding the cup across. The counter to a woman in a power suit who didn't acknowledge her existence beyond snatching the cup and hurrying toward whatever important meeting awaited her. These interactions had taught Zephyra something valuable about invisibility. As the wife of Hannah Christian, she had been perpetually observed, every gesture scrutinized and judged. Now, in her polyester uniform with her practical ponytail, she had become functionally invisible to the class of people she'd once desperately tried to impress. The liberation was intoxicating. During her break, she sat in the small employee room and counted tips, separating the crumpled bills into carefully labeled envelopes. Rent, utilities, groceries, medical expenses, emergency fund. The emergency fund was pitifully small, but it existed, a testament to her refusal to be caught completely unprepared again. Her phone buzzed with a text from Celeste. "Doctor appointment today? Want me to come with you?" Zephyra typed back quickly, "I can handle it. Thank you for offering." It wasn't entirely true. She wanted her sister there, wanted someone to hold her hand and ask the questions she was too overwhelmed to remember. But she needed to prove, to herself, to her unborn child, to the ghost of the woman she'd been, that she could navigate this alone. The prenatal clinic was a study in functional efficiency. All beige walls and motivational posters featuring diverse families, smiling in soft focus happiness. Zephyra sat in the waiting room surrounded by women in various stages of pregnancy, some accompanied by attentive partners, others like her, maintaining careful solitude. "Zephyra Nightingale?" The nurse's voice was professionally cheerful. The examination room was small and sterile, the paper crinkling beneath. Her as she settled onto the table, Dr. Patel was a no-nonsense woman who had never once asked inappropriate questions about Zephyra's circumstances or the absence of a partner at these appointments. "How are you feeling?" Dr. Patel asked, washing her hands with practiced efficiency. "Tired, but good. The morning sickness has stopped. That's normal for this stage. Any concerns?" Zephyra hesitated. There were so many concerns about money, about health insurance, about what would happen when she could no longer work on her feet for long shifts. But these weren't medical concerns. "I've been having some back pain," she said finally. "Also normal, especially with the physical demands of your work. Let's take a look at how baby is doing." The ultrasound gel was cold against her skin, but the moment the image appeared on the screen, everything else faded away. There was her child, arms and legs clearly defined now, a profile that looked remarkably human, a heart beating steady and strong. "Everything looks perfect," Dr. Patel said. "Baby is measuring right on schedule. Would you like to know the sex?" Zephyra stared at the screen, at this small person who depended on her completely. "It's a girl." "It's a girl," the doctor confirmed with a smile. "A daughter." She was carrying a daughter who would grow up knowing that her mother had chosen her over everything else in the world. The weight of responsibility was crushing and exhilarating in equal measure. "Hello, baby girl," she whispered to the image on the screen. After the appointment, she walked back to her apartment instead of taking the bus, partly to save the fare and partly to process what she'd learned. A daughter. She tried to imagine explaining to this child someday why her father had wanted nothing to do with her, how to frame abandonment in terms that wouldn't destroy a young heart. The apartment building was a testament to urban decay managed into habitable condition. The elevator was broken more often than it worked, so Zephyra climbed the stairs to her floor, her hand resting on the railing for support. The hallway smelled of cooking food and industrial cleaner, the sounds of other people's lives leaking through thin doors. Her studio apartment was small enough that she could see the entire space from the doorway. A kitchenette, with a hot plate and mini refrigerator, a fold-out table that served as desk and dining room, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, and a corner she'd designated as the nursery area where a second-hand crib waited to be assembled. She'd found the crib at a church sale, carried it home on 2 buses and her own determination. It had taken her several evenings to sand down the rough spots and paint it a soft yellow that would work for either sex. Now she knew it would cradle her daughter, this piece of furniture that represented hope made manifest. The evening shift at the office cleaning company began at sunset, giving her just enough time to grab a quick dinner of peanut butter sandwich and milk. The work was harder now that her belly had grown, requiring her to modify her movements and take more frequent breaks. But Rosa had become a fierce protector, redistributing tasks when needed and covering for Zephyra during her bathroom breaks. "You need to tell them about the baby soon," Rosa said as they worked side by side, emptying trash bins. "They can't fire you for being pregnant, but they need to know." "I know," Zephyra said. "I'm waiting until I can't hide it anymore." "Mia, you're not hiding much these days." It was true. The loose work shirts could only disguise so much, and her careful movements were becoming more obvious. "I need this job, Rosa. I need both jobs." "And you'll have them. But you can't work yourself into the ground. That baby needs you healthy." The wisdom in Rosa's words was undeniable, but so was the math of survival. Rent, utilities, food, medical expenses, the numbers added up to more than minimum wage could comfortably cover even working 2 jobs. There was no room for anything to go wrong, no buffer for emergencies or complications. As they cleaned the executive offices on the top floor, Zafira couldn't help but notice the family photos scattered across expensive desks, smiling couples with children who would never know the weight of financial insecurity, families who could afford private healthcare and emergency savings accounts that existed for convenience rather than desperation. She didn't envy them, exactly. But she did wonder what it felt like to make decisions based on preference rather than necessity, to choose a life path without calculating every potential cost. The shift ended in the early morning, and Zafira rode the late-night bus home through empty streets. The other passengers were mostly service workers like herself, people who kept the city running while everyone else slept. They formed an unspoken community of mutual respect, understanding that they were all fighting battles that daylight wouldn't acknowledge. Back in her apartment, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror and lifted her shirt, revealing the curve of her belly and profile. Her daughter was in there, growing stronger every day, preparing for a world that would be challenging but honest, difficult but real. "We're doing okay, baby girl," she said softly. "Your mama is learning how to be strong enough for both of us." She climbed into bed, exhausted but oddly satisfied. Tomorrow would bring the same routine: coffee shop shift, prenatal vitamin with lunch, cleaning offices until dawn. But each day was also building something important: proof that she could provide for her child, evidence that love could triumph over luxury, confirmation that she was becoming the mother her daughter deserved. As sleep began to claim her, Zafira thought about the woman she'd been when she'd lived in the mansion. Dependent, insecure, desperately seeking approval from people who would never truly accept her. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she'd known briefly but never really understood. The woman she was becoming was harder, leaner, infinitely more capable. This woman didn't need anyone's approval to know her worth. This woman was building a life with her own hands, creating something real and lasting from nothing but will and determination. Outside her window, the city hummed with the quiet energy of night workers and insomniacs, people pursuing dreams and survival in equal measure. Zafira fell asleep to that sound, her hand resting protectively on her belly, ready to face whatever tomorrow would demand of her. In her dreams, she was teaching her daughter to walk, to read, to stand up for herself in a world that might try to make her feel small. In her dreams, her daughter grew up strong and confident, never questioning her worth because her mother had proven through action that she was precious beyond measure. And when she woke to the sound of her alarm, Zafira carried those dreams with her into another day of building the life her daughter deserved, one honest hour at a time. Chapter 5. The Collision. Some moments split your life into before and after. This was the moment Hannah Christian's world cracked open to reveal the wasteland of his own making. The morning sun cast long shadows across the downtown medical district as Hannah Christian stepped out of his black luxury sedan, the leather interior still warm with climate-controlled perfection. He straightened his Italian silk tie and adjusted his platinum watch, a habit born of a life where every minute held purpose, every interaction served a calculated end. The meeting with his attorneys was routine, another step in the careful management of inherited wealth that occupied so much of his existence. Time had passed since Zafira had walked out of his life, enough time for him to construct a careful normalcy around the absence she'd left behind. He'd told himself repeatedly that he'd made the right choice, that cutting away the complication of her pregnancy had saved them both from a mistake that would have destroyed everything he'd worked to preserve. The streets bustled with the familiar rhythm of downtown commerce, executives in expensive suits, delivery trucks navigating narrow streets, the constant pulse of a city that measured success in profit margins and stock portfolios. It was his world, a world that made sense, where every transaction had clear terms and expected outcomes. He was walking toward the law office when he saw her. Reality fractured. The world shifted into slow motion, every detail becoming impossibly sharp and clear. There, walking out of the prenatal clinic across the street, was Zephyra Nightingale. But not the Zephyra he remembered, not the woman who had left his mansion in tears and desperation. This woman moved with purpose, her shoulders straight, despite the obvious weight she carried in front of her, the weight of their child. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and stopping his heart. She was pregnant, hugely, unmistakably, gloriously pregnant. Her belly curved proudly beneath a simple blue dress that had probably cost less than one of his ties, her hand resting protectively over the life growing inside her. She had kept the baby. The world around him continued its motion, cars honking, pedestrians hurrying past, the city maintaining its relentless pace. But Hannah stood frozen on the sidewalk, a statue carved from shock and recognition. All his carefully maintained certainty crumbled in an instant, revealing the truth he'd refused to acknowledge. She had chosen their child over his ultimatum. She moved with a grace he'd never seen in her before, a confidence that radiated from within. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of the elaborate styles his world had demanded. Her face, free of the expensive makeup and treatments that had been part of her daily routine, glowed with something he'd never been able to give her, genuine contentment. She was beautiful, more beautiful than she'd ever been in his marble palace, draped in designer gowns and dripping with jewelry. This stripped-down, authentic version of the woman he'd married was devastating in her simple radiance. A man in a suit jostled past him, muttering about tourists blocking the sidewalk, but Hannah couldn't move. He watched as Zephyra paused at the corner, her hand moving to support her lower back in a gesture that spoke of the physical demands of pregnancy. The protective instinct that rose in his chest was so fierce it nearly brought him to his knees. She was alone, completely, utterly alone. No supportive partner to help her navigate the crowded street, no luxury car waiting to carry her to comfort, no team of assistants to handle the mundane details of her life. She was managing this pregnancy, his child's gestation, entirely by herself. The traffic light changed, and she began to cross the street, moving directly toward where he stood. For a moment he thought she might walk right past him, that enough time had changed him enough that she wouldn't recognize the man who had thrown her away like damaged goods. But then she looked up. Their eyes met across the space of 3 feet and months of silence. And the impact of that connection sent shockwaves through both of them. Her step faltered slightly, her hand instinctively moving to cradle her belly as if to protect their child from his presence. The color drained from her face, but her chin lifted with a defiance he'd never seen during their marriage. Hannah. His name on her lips was neither greeting nor accusation. It was simply acknowledgement, the way one might note the presence of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Zephyra. He could barely form her name around the constriction in his throat. The baby is fine, she finished, her voice steady despite the tremor he could see in her hands. Healthy. Due soon? Soon. The word hit him like arithmetic made flesh. She was exactly as far along as she should be if she'd kept their child. If she'd defied his ultimatum and chosen life over the security he'd offered her. You kept her, he said, the words falling into the space between them like stones into still water. Her? Something flickered in Zephyra's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that he'd instinctively known the sex of their child. The baby. You kept the baby. I kept my daughter, she corrected, emphasis on the possessive. My daughter, who will grow up knowing she was wanted by the parent who mattered. The words were delivered without venom, but they cut deeper than any scream of rage could have. This wasn't the broken woman who had pleaded for his understanding before. This was someone new, someone forged in the fire of abandonment and tempered by the fierce protectiveness of motherhood. Zephyra. He reached toward her, some instinct driving him to bridge the space between them. But she stepped back smoothly, keeping the distance intact. Don't. The word was quiet but absolute. Don't say whatever you're thinking of saying. Don't apologize, don't explain, don't try to fix what you broke. We're fine without you. My daughter and me. We've been fine without you, and we'll continue to be fine without you after she's born. The casual dismissal was more devastating than anger would have been. She wasn't fighting him or raging against him. She was simply stating facts. They were fine without him. Better, perhaps, than they'd ever been with him. Where are you living? The question escaped before he could stop it, driven by a desperate need to understand how she'd survived without him. Does it matter? She asked, tilting her head slightly. You made it very clear that my circumstances after leaving your house were not your concern. Of course it matters. You're carrying my child. The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable, a hardening around her eyes, a straightening of her spine that spoke of boundaries being fortified. No, she said quietly. I'm carrying my child. You gave up any claim to her the moment you demanded I choose between her life and your approval. That's not. I didn't mean. He struggled to find words that could somehow bridge the chasm his own choices had created. I was angry. I said things I didn't mean. You said exactly what you meant, Zephyra replied with devastating clarity. You told me who you really were, Hannah. I should thank you for that honesty. It saved me from wasting any more energy believing in something that never existed. A delivery truck honked loudly behind them, the driver gesturing impatiently at their sidewalk conference. The pedestrians flowed around them like water around stones, the city indifferent to their personal apocalypse. Can we go somewhere and talk? Hannah asked desperately. Please, let me explain. There's nothing to explain, she interrupted. And nowhere for us to go. I have to get to work. The reality of her circumstances hit him with fresh force. While he'd been maintaining his empire of comfort and convenience, she'd been working to survive. While he'd been sleeping in climate-controlled luxury, she'd been building a life from nothing. What kind of work? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The kind that pays the bills, she said simply. The kind that lets me take care of my daughter, her daughter. Not their daughter, not even the daughter, my daughter. The possessive was like a knife between his ribs. Zephyra, please. I know I made mistakes. For the first time, real emotion crept into her voice. Not anger, but something deeper and more dangerous. You didn't make mistakes, Hannah. You made choices. Deliberate, calculated choices about what kind of man you wanted to be and what kind of life you wanted to live. Those weren't mistakes. They were revelations. She shifted slightly, accommodating the weight of her pregnancy, and he saw the flash of exhaustion that crossed her features, despite her composed exterior. She was tired, probably overworked, definitely struggling in ways he could fix with a phone call and a bank transfer. Let me help, he said urgently. Let me support you, support the baby. You don't have to do this alone. Yes, I do, she said with quiet finality. Because doing it alone means doing it honestly. It means my daughter will grow up knowing that her mother chose her without conditions, without ultimatums, without asking her to earn the right to exist. She turned to walk away, and panic seized him. Zephyra, wait, please, can I see you again? Can we talk about this properly? She paused, looking back over her shoulder with something that might have been pity. There's nothing to talk about, Hannah. You said everything that needed saying before. I heard you clearly then, and I hear you clearly now. What do you hear now? He asked desperately. Regret, she said simply. But regret isn't the same as love, and it's not the same as change. It's just the sound a man makes when he realizes the true cost of his choices. She walked away then, moving through the crowd with the particular grace of a woman who had learned to navigate the world entirely on her own terms. Hannah stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching her disappear into the urban landscape, carrying their daughter toward a future he'd forfeited any right to share. The meeting with his attorneys was forgotten. Everything was forgotten, except the image of Zephyra, proud, pregnant, and completely beyond his reach, walking away from him for the second time. But this time, he understood with crushing clarity that she wasn't walking away from him. She was walking toward something infinitely better. As he finally moved toward his car, his legs unsteady beneath him, Hannah felt the weight of what he'd seen settling over him like a shroud. She hadn't just survived without him, she had thrived. The woman walking away from him was stronger, more confident, more genuinely beautiful than the one he'd thrown out of his house. And their daughter, his daughter, was growing inside her, already more loved and wanted by her mother than he had ever been capable of loving anyone. The child he had rejected was becoming the center of someone's universe, the meaning around which an entire life was being rebuilt. He had lost them both before he'd ever really had them, and the fault was entirely his own. The drive back to his empty mansion was a blur of regret and recognition. Somewhere in the city behind him, Zafira was going to work, building the life she'd chosen, carrying his child toward a birth he would not witness and a childhood he would not share. He had seen his future walk away from him on a downtown sidewalk, and there was nothing he could do to call it back. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. Consequences are the universe's way of teaching. Lessons to those who refuse to learn them through love. The mahogany walls of the Christian family estate study had witnessed generations of power conversations, but none quite like the one unfolding on this grey afternoon. Hannah sat across from his mother, Victoria Christian, whose silver hair was pulled back in a style that spoke of old money and older disappointments. The antique clock on the mantelpiece ticked with metronomic precision, marking the seconds of a silence that had stretched beyond comfortable into hostile territory. "All this time," Victoria said finally, her voice carrying the kind of disappointment that could freeze blood. "You've known about your pregnant wife all this time, and you chose to let us find out from Martha Blackwell at the country club." Hannah winced at the mention of Martha Blackwell, the society gossip whose tongue was sharper than her charity work was generous. "Mother, I can explain." "Explain!" Victoria's laugh was brittle as autumn leaves. "Explain how you threw a pregnant woman out of this house? Explain how you abandoned your own flesh and blood? Explain how you've managed to disgrace generations of Christian family values in a single act of cruelty?" The weight of her judgment settled on his shoulders like lead. Victoria Christian had built her life on the careful cultivation of reputation, on the delicate balance of social standing and moral authority that allowed families like theirs to maintain their position in society's upper echelons. Her son's actions had shattered that carefully constructed facade. "She tried to trap me," Hannah said weakly, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "The pregnancy was planned, calculated." "Stop." Victoria's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. "Just stop talking before you make this any worse than it already is." She stood and moved to the window that overlooked the sprawling gardens where Hannah had played as a child, where he'd learned about responsibility and legacy and the weight of carrying a family name. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now discussing how he'd failed to carry that weight with any honor. "Do you know what people are saying about us?" Victoria asked without turning around. "Do you know what your behavior has cost this family?" "People talk," Hannah said defensively. "They always talk. They're saying we raised a monster," Victoria said quietly. "They're saying that beneath all our charity work and community involvement, we're just another family of entitled predators who use people and throw them away when they become inconvenient." The accusation hit harder than a physical blow. The Christian family had built their reputation on public service, on treating their wealth as a responsibility rather than a privilege. For generations, they'd been pillars of their community, examples of how prosperity could be wielded with grace and compassion. "It's not that simple," Hannah protested. Victoria turned from the window, and for the first time in his adult life, Hannah saw his mother as an old woman, tired, disappointed, and utterly disgusted with the man she'd raised. "It's exactly that simple," she said. "You married a young woman who loved you completely. She carried your child and came to you with joy, expecting to share that happiness with her husband. And you threw her into the street like garbage. She was trying to manipulate me. She was trying to build a family with you." Victoria's composure finally cracked. revealing the fury beneath her carefully maintained exterior. She was offering you the chance to be something more than just another wealthy man collecting beautiful objects. She was offering you the chance to be a father, a real father, not just a provider of genetic material and money. Hannah stood abruptly, pacing to the fireplace where portraits of Christian patriarchs watched him with painted eyes that seemed full of judgment. You don't understand what the marriage was really like. You don't know how I know she organized charity drives that raised millions for children's hospitals, Victoria interrupted. I know she spent Christmas morning serving meals at homeless shelters instead of opening presents. I know she never asked for anything beyond your love and respect, both of which you were apparently incapable of giving. The truth of it settled over him like a shroud. Zephyra had been everything his mother described and more. Generous, selfless, genuinely committed to using their wealth to help others. She'd thrown herself into charitable work not for social advancement, but because she genuinely cared about making the world better. Your father and I received a letter yesterday, Victoria continued, moving to her desk and retrieving an envelope with the Christian family crest. From the board of the Children's Foundation. They're removing the Christian name from the literacy program that Zephyra developed. Apparently, they don't want to be associated with a family that abandons pregnant women. The words hit him like a physical blow. The literacy program had been Zephyra's passion project, a comprehensive initiative that brought reading programs to underserved communities. She'd spent months developing the curriculum, securing funding, building partnerships with local schools. It had been set to launch under the Christian Foundation name, a legacy project that would have helped thousands of children. They can't do that, Hannah said weakly. They can, and they have, Victoria replied. And they're not the only ones. The museum board has asked for your resignation. The hospital auxiliary has declined our annual donation. Several charity organizations have returned checks rather than be associated with our family name. Each revelation was another nail in the coffin of his reputation. The carefully constructed network of social and professional relationships that had taken generations to build was crumbling around him, dismantled by the consequences of his own choices. There's more, Victoria said, her voice heavy with disappointment. Your brother called this morning. The mention of his brother Marcus sent a chill through Hannah's chest. Marcus lived overseas, managing the European interests, and maintained careful distance from the social obligations that came with the Christian name in America. If the scandal had reached him, it had truly gone global. He's flying back next week, Victoria continued, to discuss whether you should remain in control of the family trust. The family trust. The financial foundation that controlled not just his personal wealth, but the legacy of generations of Christian prosperity. The trust that funded their charitable work, their community initiatives, their ability to make meaningful change in the world. He can't remove me from the trust, Hannah said. But uncertainty crept into his voice. He can if the other trustees agree that your actions have compromised the family's ability to fulfill our charitable obligations, Victoria replied. And given what's happened to our reputation, and that case becomes easier to make every day. Hannah sank into the leather chair that had been his father's favorite, feeling the weight of legacy and expectation crushing down on him. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd inherited, everything he'd taken for granted, was slipping away because of one moment of selfish cruelty. Where is she now? Victoria asked quietly. Zephyra, where is she living? How is she supporting herself? The questions he'd been trying not to think about crashed over him. I don't know, he admitted. You don't know. Victoria's voice was flat with disbelief. Your wife is heavily pregnant with your child. And you don't know where she lives or how she's surviving. Ex-wife, Hannah corrected automatically. She's not your ex-wife, Victoria snapped. You're still married, which makes this situation even more shameful. You've abandoned your pregnant wife, not just a girlfriend or casual relationship. You've violated the most basic sacred vows a man can make, The legal reality of their situation hit him with fresh force. They were indeed still married. He'd been so focused on cutting ties that he'd never actually filed for divorce. In the eyes of the law, he was a husband who had thrown his pregnant wife out of their home. "I hired an investigator," Hannah admitted quietly. "She's working multiple jobs, living in a studio apartment downtown. She looks—" He struggled to find words that could capture what he'd seen on the street. "She looks tired. But she also looks different. Stronger, maybe." "Stronger because she had to become stronger," Victoria said with devastating accuracy. "Stronger because you left her no choice but to grow into someone who could survive your abandonment." Through the study's windows, Hannah could see the gardeners maintaining the perfectly manicured landscape, their work invisible to most of the family, but essential to maintaining the beauty they took for granted. He thought of Zephyrah working night shifts, her hands growing calloused from labor he'd never imagined her capable of performing. "I want to fix this," he said finally. "You can't," Victoria replied without hesitation. "Some things, once broken, can't be repaired. Some wounds, once inflicted, never heal completely. What you can do is try to minimize the damage going forward." "What do you mean?" Victoria moved to her desk and began writing on personal stationery. "I'm establishing a trust fund for your daughter. Money that will ensure she has everything she needs. Healthcare, education, security, without requiring any contact with you." "You can't do that without my permission." "I can and I will," Victoria said, not looking up from her writing. "Because someone in this family needs to take responsibility for that child, and clearly it won't be her father." The dismissal in her voice was absolute. In the span of one conversation, he'd gone from heir apparent to family disgrace, from trusted inheritor to cautionary tale. "The investigator says she's due soon," Anna said quietly. "Then she'll have weeks to prepare for motherhood while working multiple jobs because her husband decided his convenience was more important than his family," Victoria replied. "Weeks to ready herself for labor and delivery, without support, without help, without the partner who promised to stand by her through everything." Each word was a fresh wound, a new recognition of the depth of his failure. He thought of Zephyrah navigating prenatal appointments alone, assembling nursery furniture in a studio apartment, preparing for the most vulnerable moment of her life, without anyone to hold her hand or advocate for her needs. "I could be there," he said desperately. "For the birth, I mean. I could—" "You forfeited that right when you threw her out," Victoria said, finally looking up from her letter. "You don't get to show up for the moment of joy after missing all the months of struggle. You don't get to claim the title of father after rejecting the responsibilities of husband." The study fell silent except for the steady ticking of the antique clock, each second marking the passage of time he could never recover, opportunities he could never reclaim. Outside, the world continued its rotation. Indifferent to his personal catastrophe. "She'll be a good mother," Hannah said finally, the admission torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "Yes," Victoria agreed, "she will be. And that child will grow up knowing that her mother was strong enough to choose love over luxury, principle over comfort. She'll grow up with values you apparently never learned, despite every advantage we tried to give you." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the study floor, Hannah Christian sat surrounded by the portraits of ancestors who had built something meaningful with their wealth and influence, and contemplated how completely he had failed to live up to their example. Somewhere across the city, Zephyrah was preparing for another night of work, carrying his child toward a future he had no place in, building something beautiful from the ashes of what he had destroyed. Chapter 7. The Birth. In the moment when life enters the world, all pretense falls away, leaving only truth, pain, and the fierce love that makes both bearable. The first contraction hit Zephyrah while she was restocking paper towels in the executive washroom on the 42nd floor of the Meridian building. The pain started low in her back and wrapped around her belly like a steel band, slowly tightening. stealing her breath and forcing her to grip the marble countertop until her knuckles went white. For a moment, she stood perfectly still in the mirror-lined space, watching her reflection breathe through the pain. This was it. After carrying her daughter for what felt like a lifetime, after carefully saved dollars and hand-me-down baby clothes and a crib assembled with determination and online tutorials, her daughter was ready to make her entrance into the world. The contraction passed, leaving her shaky but functional. She checked her supplies. She still had several floors to complete before the cleaning shift ended. If this was early labor, she might have plenty of time yet. She could finish the shift, catch the bus home, and call the doctor from her apartment. The second contraction came stronger and more insistent. This time, she had to stop working entirely, leaning against the wall of an empty conference room while the pain washed over her in waves. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sparkled in the darkness below, millions of people sleeping peacefully while her body began the ancient work of bringing new life into the world. Zephyra. Rosa's voice carried genuine concern as she found her in the conference room. Mia, what's wrong? You look... Her experienced eyes took in Zephyra's pale face and the protective way she held her belly. Oh, honey, is it time? I think so, Zephyra said through gritted teeth as another contraction built. But they're still far apart. I can finish. You can finish nothing, Rosa said firmly, already reaching for her phone. I'm calling you a taxi. You need to get to the hospital. I can't afford a taxi, Zephyra protested, even as part of her wanted nothing more than to sink into the back seat of a car and let someone else worry about transportation. I'm calling the taxi, Rosa repeated. You worry about having that baby safely. The ride to the hospital was a blur of stoplights and empty streets, punctuated by contractions that were coming closer together now, each one more intense than the last. The taxi driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a thick accent, kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror. First baby? He asked as they pulled into the hospital emergency entrance. Yes, Zephyra managed between breaths. My wife, she had 5 babies, he said, turning to face her as he stopped the car. Every time I tell her the same thing, women are the strongest people in the world. You remember that, okay? You are stronger than you know. The words followed her through the automatic doors of the emergency room, where fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and the smell of antiseptic mixed with coffee from the nurse's station. The admission process was mercifully quick. Her pre-registration and insurance information were already in the system, one small benefit of the careful planning that had consumed her life for months. Zephyra Nightingale, a nurse with graying hair and competent hands, appeared with a wheelchair. I'm Janet. Let's get you upstairs and see how this baby is doing. The labor and delivery ward was painted in soft pastels, designed to create an atmosphere of calm that didn't quite mask the underlying tension of a place where medical emergencies could unfold without warning. Zephyra's room was small but private, with a single bed, monitors that would track her contractions and the baby's heartbeat, and a window that looked out over the hospital parking lot. Any support person coming? Janet asked as she helped Zephyra into the hospital gown that tied in the back and left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. No, Zephyra said quietly. Just me, Janet's expression softened. Honey, you sure? Sometimes people change their minds when babies are actually coming. Want me to call anyone? For a brief moment, Zephyra thought about Celeste, who would drop everything and race to the hospital if she called. But her sister lived far away and had her own family to worry about. This was something she needed to do alone, just as she'd done everything else since leaving the mansion. I'm sure, she said. It's just me and her. Then me and the doctor will take good care of both of you, Janet promised. The contractions intensified as the morning progressed, coming in waves that built to crushing peaks before receding enough to let her catch her breath. Between them, she walked the halls of the maternity ward, her hand pressed to her lower back, watching other women in various stages of labor being supported by husbands, mothers, sisters, friends. The loneliness was sharp and immediate, but so was her determination to prove that love didn't require a crowd. Dr. Patel arrived during one of Zephyr's walking sessions, finding her leaning against the wall of the corridor, breathing through a particularly strong contraction. "How are we doing?" the doctor asked, her professional calm reassuring in the chaos of labor. "It hurts more than I expected," Zephyr admitted as the contraction passed. "That's honest," Dr. Patel said with a small smile, "and completely normal. Let's check your progress." Back in the room, connected to monitors that traced the rhythm of her daughter's heartbeat and the mountain peaks of her contractions, Zephyra tried to focus on the positive aspects of her situation. She had insurance, thanks to the coffee shop job. She had a doctor she trusted. She had a healthy baby who was apparently eager to meet the world. What she didn't have was anyone to hold her hand when the pain became overwhelming. Anyone to remind her to breathe when panic started to set in. Anyone to tell her she was strong enough for this when her body felt like it was being torn apart from the inside. The thought of Hannah intruded unwillingly during a brief respite between contractions. She wondered if he even knew she was in labor, if some part of him might sense that his daughter was about to enter the world. The idea filled her with a complex mixture of longing and fury. Longing for the support he should have provided, fury that he'd forfeited any right to be part of this moment. Mrs. Nightingale, a different nurse, appeared in the doorway, her expression uncertain. "There's a gentleman in the waiting room asking about you. Says he's the baby's father." Zephyr's blood went cold. "What's his name?" "Hannah Christian. He's asking if he can—" "No." The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "He can't. I don't want him here." The nurse's eyebrows rose slightly, but her professional training kept her expression neutral. "Are you sure? Sometimes during labor, people—" "I'm sure," Zephyr said firmly, even as another contraction began building. "He chose not to be part of this. I'm not changing that decision for him now." Down in the waiting room, Hannah paced like a caged animal, his expensive suit incongruous among the casual clothes of other expectant fathers. He'd received the call from his private investigator at dawn. Zephira had been admitted to the hospital in active labor. He'd broken every speed limit getting there, his heart hammering with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. She was having their baby. Right now, stories above his head, Zephira was bringing their daughter into the world. And he was trapped in a beige waiting room, as shut out from the process as if he lived on another planet. "Sir," the nurse who had asked about him earlier returned, her expression sympathetic but firm. "She's asked that you not be present during the delivery." "I'm sorry." The rejection hit him like a physical blow, but he couldn't argue with it. What right did he have to witness the miracle of his daughter's birth when he'd rejected the miracle of her conception? What claim could he make to this moment when he'd spent months pretending it wasn't happening? "Can you at least tell her that I'm here?" he asked desperately. "That I want to be here? I'll let her know," the nurse said gently. "But sir, she's in active labor. This isn't the time for reconciliation or explanations. Right now, she needs to focus on delivering this baby safely." Upstairs, Zephira labored through the afternoon and into the evening. Her world narrowed to the space between contractions and the growing intensity of her body's work. Janet stayed with her through shift changes, providing the steady presence and gentle encouragement that helped her navigate the most challenging physical experience of her life. "I can see the head," Dr. Patel announced during one of the final pushes. "She's got lots of dark hair, just like her mama." The last stage of labor was a symphony of effort and reward, pain and triumph. When her daughter finally slipped into the world, the silence that followed her first cry was sacred, a moment of pure miracle that belonged entirely to mother and child. "She's perfect," Dr. Patel said, placing the baby on Zephira's chest. "Absolutely perfect." Through tears of exhaustion and overwhelming love, Zephira looked down at her daughter, tiny and red and absolutely beautiful. With Hannah's dark hair and what might someday be his strong jawline, but eyes that were purely her own. The love that flooded through her was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Fierce and protective and utterly transformative. "Hello, beautiful girl," she whispered, touching her daughter's perfect fingers. "I'm your mama, and I've been waiting so long to meet you." The baby settled against her chest, as if she'd always belonged there. And in that moment, Zephyra understood with crystalline clarity that every sacrifice had been worth it. Every night of exhaustion, every moment of financial terror, every hour of loneliness, all of it had led to this perfect moment when she became someone new, a mother. 2 floors below, Hannah sat in the waiting room until well past midnight, hoping for some word, some acknowledgement that his daughter had been born. But the only information he received came from the same private investigator who had called him that morning. Serenity Nightingale had been born healthy, and both mother and daughter were doing well. Serenity Nightingale, not Serenity Christian. His daughter would carry her mother's name, not his, a final, decisive break from the legacy he'd thrown away through his own cruelty. As he finally drove home through empty streets, Hannah knew that somewhere behind him, in a hospital room he'd been barred from entering, the most important moment of his life had happened without him. His daughter had taken her first breath, opened her eyes for the first time, and been welcomed into the world by a mother whose love was already complete and unconditional. He had lost them both forever, and the fault was entirely his own. Chapter 8. The Rejection. Some doors, once closed by cruelty, can never be reopened by regret, no matter how desperately one pounds against them. The hospital room was suffused with the soft golden light of afternoon, filtering through blinds that Zephyra had adjusted to create the perfect environment for her daughter's first full day of life. Serenity lay sleeping in the clear plastic bassinet beside the bed, wrapped in the pink and blue striped blanket that was standard issue for all newborns, but somehow looked uniquely precious when draped around this particular child. Zephyra couldn't stop staring at her. Every few minutes, she found herself reaching out to touch a tiny hand or stroke the soft down of dark hair that crowned Serenity's perfect head. The wonder of it, that she had created this perfect human being, that this child was hers to love and protect, hadn't faded even slightly since the moment of birth. "She's beautiful," said Janet, the nurse who had stayed beyond her shift the previous evening and returned this morning to check on them. "Look at those eyelashes. She's going to be a heartbreaker." "She's going to be strong," Zephyra corrected gently. "Strong and independent and never afraid to stand up for herself, like her mama," Janet said with a knowing smile. A soft knock interrupted their conversation, and Dr. Patel appeared in the doorway with a clipboard and the efficient manner that characterized her rounds. "How are my 2 favorite patients today?" she asked, moving to check the monitors that had tracked Zephyra's recovery through the night. "Good," Zephyra said, though the word didn't begin to capture the complex mixture of exhaustion, euphoria, and overwhelming protectiveness that had settled over her. "She's been nursing well, sleeping between feedings. I think we're figuring each other out. That's exactly what should be happening," Dr. Patel confirmed, making notes on her chart. "Any pain? Excessive bleeding? Concerns about healing?" Zephyra took inventory of her body, which felt foreign after months of pregnancy and the intensity of labor. Everything ached in ways she hadn't expected, but there was also a sense of accomplishment, of having completed something monumentally important. "I'm sore, but nothing that feels wrong," she said. "More like I ran a marathon." "That's a pretty accurate comparison," Dr. Patel said with a laugh. "Your body has done incredible work. Give yourself time to heal, both physically and emotionally. This is a major life transition." Before Zephyra could respond, another knock came at the door, this one more hesitant, uncertain. Janet moved to answer it, and Zephyra heard her speaking in low tones to someone in the hallway. When the nurse returned, her expression was carefully neutral. "Mrs. Nightingale, there's someone here to see you, Mr. Christian. He's asking if he can visit with you and the baby." The peace that had settled over the room evaporated instantly. Zephyra felt her entire body tense, her protective instincts flaring like a mother animal sensing a threat to her young. "No," she said immediately. "I told you yesterday I don't want him here." "I know," Janet said gently. "But he's been in the waiting room since early this morning. He says he just wants to see the baby for a few minutes. Sometimes after birth people reconsider." "I haven't reconsidered anything," Zephyra said firmly. "He made his choice months ago. This is mine." Dr. Patel looked between the nurse and her patient, clearly sensing the undercurrents of a complex situation. "Mrs. Nightingale, if you don't want visitors, that's your absolute right. No one can force you to see anyone during your recovery." "Thank you," Zephyra said, relief flooding through her. "Please tell him to leave." But even as Janet went to deliver the message, Zephyra could feel her resolve being tested. Part of her, a small, treacherous part, wanted to see Hannah's face when he looked at their daughter for the first time, wanted to witness the moment when he understood what he'd rejected, what he'd thrown away in his arrogance and cruelty. The larger part of her, the part that had grown strong during months of solitude and struggle, knew that opening that door even a crack would be a mistake. Hannah had forfeited his right to witness these precious early moments. He didn't get to show up now and claim a connection he'd spent months denying. Later, as she was attempting to nurse serenity through the awkward choreography of new motherhood, another knock came at the door. This time it was Dr. Williams, the hospital's patient advocate, a woman Zephyra had never met but who radiated the kind of professional competence that suggested she was accustomed to navigating difficult family situations. "Miss Nightingale, I'm sorry to disturb you," Dr. Williams said, entering with a manila folder under her arm. "I wanted to speak with you about Mr. Christian's request to see the baby." "I've already said no," Zephyra said, her voice sharp with fatigue and frustration. "How many times do I have to refuse?" "I understand your position completely," Dr. Williams said, settling into the chair beside the bed. "And legally you have every right to control who visits during your hospital stay. However, I wanted to make sure you understand the full situation." Zephyra adjusted Serenity's position, grateful for the excuse to avoid eye contact while her emotions churned. "What situation?" "Mr. Christian is listed as the father on the birth certificate you filled out. That gives him certain legal rights that will eventually supersede hospital visitation policies." The words sent a chill through Zephyra's chest. "What kind of rights?" "The right to establish paternity, to seek visitation, potentially to pursue custody arrangements," Dr. Williams explained gently. "I'm not saying any of that will happen, but I want you to be prepared for the possibility that this won't end with him leaving the hospital." Zephyra felt the world tilt slightly, the euphoria of new motherhood suddenly shadowed by the specter of legal battles and forced separations. She looked down at Serenity, who had fallen asleep at her breast, tiny fist curled against her mother's skin in perfect trust. "He abandoned us," she said quietly. "He demanded I choose between the baby and him, and when I chose her, he threw us out. Doesn't that matter?" "It might in court," Dr. Williams said carefully. "But family law is complex, and biological fathers have rights that don't necessarily depend on their behavior during pregnancy. I'd strongly recommend consulting with a family law attorney as soon as possible." The conversation left Zephyra feeling vulnerable in ways she hadn't expected. She'd spent months building a life that didn't depend on Hannah, creating a bubble of safety and independence for herself and her daughter. Now the reality of shared biology was threatening to pierce that bubble. As afternoon melted into evening, she found herself staring out the window at the parking lot below, wondering if Hannah was still somewhere in the building, still fighting for access to a child he'd rejected before she was even born. The answer came with the dinner cart. When Janet appeared with a tray of hospital food and an expression that suggested she was the bearer of news Zephyra wouldn't want to hear. "He's still here," the nurse said without preamble. "Mr. Christian," He's been in the family consultation room all day, talking to lawyers on his phone. Dr. Williams thinks he might be preparing to file some kind of emergency petition. Zephyrah's appetite disappeared instantly. To do what? To establish immediate visitation rights, Janet said gently. I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you want to hear, especially not when you should be focusing on recovery and bonding with your baby. The injustice of it was overwhelming. After months of managing everything alone, the pregnancy, the medical appointments, the financial stress, the emotional labor of preparing for motherhood, Hannah could potentially swoop in with expensive lawyers and demand access to the child he'd never wanted. What would that mean? Zephyrah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Janet admitted. But honey, maybe you should consider seeing him now, on your terms, rather than waiting for a court to force the issue later. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, even though Zephyrah wanted to wave it away. She looked down at Serenity, who slept with the absolute peace of someone who trusted completely in her mother's protection. Could she maintain that protection if she continued to refuse all contact with Hannah, or would intransigence now lead to worse complications later? 5 minutes, she said finally, the words feeling like they were being torn from her chest. He can see her for 5 minutes. But I want a nurse in the room the entire time, and if I tell him to leave, he leaves immediately. Janet nodded quickly. I'll stay with you. And Dr. Williams can be on standby if needed. A short while later, Hannah Christian stood in the doorway of the hospital room, looking more uncertain than Zephyrah had ever seen him. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, hair uncombed, shirt wrinkled, stubble shadowing his jaw, as if he'd forgotten to shave. His eyes went immediately to the bassinet beside her bed, and she watched his face transform as he caught his first glimpse of their daughter. He stopped, swallowing hard. She's beautiful. She's perfect, Zephyrah corrected, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Hannah took a step closer, his movements slow and careful, as if he were approaching a wild animal that might bolt. Is it okay if You can look, Zephyrah said firmly. You cannot touch her. You cannot hold her. You can look at what you rejected, and then you can leave. The cruelty of her words was intentional, designed to remind him and herself of the choice he'd made months before. But watching his face as he stared at Serenity, seeing the raw longing and regret that flickered across his features, she felt something unexpected, pity. I was wrong, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. About everything. About you, about the baby, about what mattered. I was terrified and selfish and completely wrong. Yes, you were, Zephyrah agreed. And admitting that doesn't change anything, doesn't it? He looked at her directly for the first time since entering the room. Doesn't the fact that I understand my mistakes matter at all? Understanding your mistakes and living with the consequences of them are two different things, she said. You don't get credit for figuring out what you should have known from the beginning. Hannah's jaw worked silently, and she could see him struggling with words that wouldn't come. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely audible. Can I at least know her name? Serenity, Zephyrah said. Serenity Nightingale. Not Christian. You forfeited that right when you told me to choose between her and you, Zephyrah said. She's mine, Hannah, completely and entirely mine. You're nothing to her but genetic material. The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Hannah actually staggered slightly, gripping the doorframe for support. Please, he said, and the broken quality of his voice almost undermined her resolve. Please don't shut me out completely. I know I don't deserve anything, but she's my daughter too. I want to be part of her life. I want to try to be the father she deserves. The father she deserves would have been here from the beginning, Zephyrah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. The father she deserves would have supported her mother through pregnancy. The father she deserves would have chosen her the moment he learned of her existence. I can't change the past, Hannah said desperately. But I can change the future. I can be better. Your 5 minutes are up, Zephyrah interrupted, turning her attention back to Serenity, who had begun to stir in her bassinet. Janet, please show Mr. Christian out. As the nurse moved toward the door, Hannah made one last desperate attempt. "Zephyra, please, don't take away my chance to know my daughter. Don't punish her for my mistakes." She looked at him one final time. This man who had once been her entire world, and felt nothing but the cold clarity of absolute certainty. "I'm not punishing her," she said. "I'm protecting her from disappointment, from abandonment, from learning that the father who rejected her existence thinks an apology entitles him to her love." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Zephyra alone with her daughter and the absolute conviction that she had done the right thing. Outside in the hallway, she could hear Hannah's voice rising in what sounded like argument, but it faded quickly as he was escorted away from the maternity ward. Serenity opened her eyes then, dark and unfocused, but somehow seeming to look directly at her mother's face. Zephyra lifted her from the bassinet, cradling her against her chest where she belonged. "It's just us, beautiful girl," she whispered. "Just us, and that's all we need." Chapter 9. The Long Road. Time is the cruelest teacher. It shows us exactly who we are when all our excuses have been stripped away. The coffee shop on Maple Street had become Zephyra's kingdom by the time Serenity could walk. A small empire built on determination and the kind of customer service that came from genuinely caring about people rather than merely tolerating them. She stood behind the espresso machine, Serenity perched on her hip, watching steam curl from the milk frother with the fascination that only toddlers could bring to ordinary magic. "Mama work," Serenity announced to no one in particular, her vocabulary expanding daily with the confidence of a child who had never doubted her place in the world. "That's right, baby girl," Zephyra said, pressing a kiss to her daughter's dark curls. "Mama's working so we can have our own place and our own things." The apartment above the coffee shop wasn't much larger than the studio they'd left behind, but it was theirs, paid for with money Zephyra had earned herself, furnished with pieces she'd chosen, decorated with Serenity's artwork and the photographs that documented their life together. Every stick of furniture, every dish in the cupboard, every toy scattered across the living room floor represented independence earned through sweat and stubbornness. The evening customers had thinned to a handful of regulars when the door chimed, admitting a figure that made Zephyra's entire body tense with recognition. Hannah stepped inside, older somehow, his face bearing lines that hadn't been there when she'd known him. His expensive clothes hung differently on a frame that looked diminished, as if the weight of his choices had physically compressed him. "We're closing," Zephyra said immediately, her arms tightening protectively around Serenity. "I know," Hannah said quietly. "I waited until you were almost done. I didn't want to disrupt your workday." It was a small courtesy, but one that acknowledged the reality of her life in ways he'd never bothered with during their marriage. Still, Zephyra felt no inclination toward gratitude. "What do you want?" she asked bluntly. Hannah's eyes found Serenity, and the naked longing in his expression was painful to witness. The little girl stared back at him with the frank curiosity of childhood, unafraid but uninterested, as if he were simply another customer who might or might not tip well. "I wanted to see her," he said, "to see how she's growing." "She's growing fine," Zephyra replied. "Healthy, happy, smart, and completely unaware that her biological father exists. I intend to keep it that way." The words hit their mark. Hannah flinched visibly but didn't retreat. "Zephyra, it's been a while. Don't I think what?" she interrupted. "That you've suffered enough? That time somehow erases the choice you made? That I should reward your regret by giving you access to the child you rejected?" Serenity, sensing tension in her mother's voice, began to fuss slightly. Zephyra immediately shifted into the soothing rhythm that had become second nature, gentle swaying, soft humming, the kind of maternal comfort that comes naturally to women who have never questioned their child's worth. "She looks like you," Hannah said softly, watching the interaction with something approaching reverence. "She looks like herself," Zephyra corrected. "She's her own person, with her own personality and her own future. A future that doesn't include you." The finality in her voice should have ended the conversation, but Hannah seemed determined to push against boundaries that had been firmly established. "The legal papers you filed," he said carefully, "terminating my parental rights. I haven't signed them." Zephyra went very still. The documents had been her attorney's idea, a legal severing of any claim Hannah might have to Serenity's life, supported by evidence of abandonment during pregnancy and his complete absence from the child's life since birth. They'd been sitting on his lawyer's desk for months. "Then you'll be in contempt when the court order comes through," she said evenly. "Your signature is a formality, not a requirement." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to talk to you before I signed them. To ask you to consider supervised visitation instead. I could see her occasionally, for short periods, with whatever conditions you think are appropriate." The audacity of the request was breathtaking. After complete absence, he wanted to stroll back into their lives with a court-approved schedule, as if fatherhood were a hobby he'd temporarily abandoned but now wished to resume. "No," Zephyra said simply. "She deserves to know her father," Hannah pressed, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "She deserves to know a father who wanted her," Zephyra replied. "Since that's not you, she's better off without any father at all." "I want her now," he insisted. "I've learned from my mistakes. I've grown. I can be the father she needs." Zephyra laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. "You want her now? Where were you when she had colic and I walked the floors every night? Where were you when she took her first steps and I had no one to share that moment with? Where were you during her first Christmas, her first birthday, her first word?" Each question was a knife thrust, precisely aimed at the catalogue of moments he'd missed through his own choice. Hannah absorbed them without flinching, as if he deserved the pain they inflicted. "I was wrong," he said. "I was selfish and scared and completely wrong about everything that mattered. But punishing me shouldn't mean punishing her." "I'm not punishing anyone," Zephyra said, moving toward the door to indicate the conversation was over. "I'm protecting my daughter from someone who has already proven he's unreliable when things get difficult." "I've changed," Hannah said desperately, following her toward the exit. "Have you?" Zephyra paused with her hand on the door handle. "Because from where I'm standing, you look like the same man who threw a pregnant woman out of his house, rather than accept responsibility for his actions." The accusation hung in the air between them, and for a moment Zephyra thought she saw a flicker of the old arrogance in his eyes, the entitlement that had always lurked beneath his charm. But it passed quickly, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "I lost everything," he said quietly. "Most of my assets, my reputation, my place in society, all of it gone because of the choices I made." "Good," Zephyra said without sympathy. "Maybe next time you'll think before you destroy innocent lives for your own convenience." "There won't be a next time," he said. "I'll never have another chance to be a father." "Serenity is my only child, my only opportunity to be something more than the man who lost everything that mattered." The pain in his voice was genuine, but Zephyra had learned to distinguish between regret for his actions and regret for their consequences. This sounded distinctly like the latter. "That's not my problem," she said, opening the door and stepping outside with Serenity still in her arms. "Your redemption isn't my responsibility." The street outside was quiet, in the way that small commercial districts became after closing time, when the shopkeepers went home to their families and left the sidewalks to dog walkers and people with nowhere else to be. Hannah followed her out, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Tell me what I can do to earn the right to know my daughter." Zephyra turned to face him, and in the glow of the streetlight, she could see the full extent of his deterioration. He looked older than his years, worn down by losses that money couldn't restore and connections couldn't rebuild. For a brief moment, she felt something that might have been pity. "You can sign those papers," she said firmly. "You can let us live our lives without the threat of legal battles hanging over our heads. You can accept that some mistakes are too big to fix, and if I don't?" He asked, though the question sounded more like defeat than defiance. Then you'll spend whatever fortune you have left fighting a battle you can't win, Zephyra said, because I'll never stop protecting her from people who might hurt her. And that includes biological fathers who treated her like an inconvenience. She shifted Serenity to her other hip, the little girl now drowsy and content to watch the world from her mother's arms. This was their life, simple, honest, built on love rather than obligation. It wasn't the life Zephyra had once imagined for herself, but it was infinitely better than the gilded cage she'd escaped. "She's beautiful," Hannah said softly, his eyes fixed on Serenity's face. "And she looks happy." "She is happy," Zephyra confirmed. "She's loved completely and without conditions. She'll never have to wonder if she's wanted or worry that her existence is a burden to the people who are supposed to care for her." The implication was clear. Serenity's happiness was possible precisely because Hannah wasn't part of her life. The message landed with devastating accuracy. "I should go," he said finally, stepping back toward his car, a modest sedan that was a far cry from the luxury vehicles he'd once favored. "Yes," Zephyra agreed. "You should." But as he walked away, she called after him one last time. "Hannah!" He turned, hope flickering in his eyes. "Sign the papers," she said quietly. "Give us both the peace of knowing this is really over." He nodded slowly, the gesture heavy with finality. "I will." As his car disappeared down the street, Zephyra stood on the sidewalk, holding her daughter, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction of a life built entirely through her own choices. Serenity had fallen asleep against her shoulder, trusting completely in her mother's strength and protection. "Come on, baby girl," she whispered, turning toward the stairs that led to their apartment. "Let's go home." Home. The word carried weight it had never held during her marriage to Hannah. This small apartment above a coffee shop, paid for with wages earned through honest work, was more truly home than any mansion could ever be. It was the place where she'd learned to be strong, where she'd discovered that independence was worth more than security, where she was raising a daughter who would never question her own worth. Several weeks later, the signed termination papers arrived by courier. Hannah Christian had officially relinquished all legal claim to Serenity Nightingale, severing the last formal connection between their lives. Zephyra filed the documents in the small safe she kept in her bedroom closet, next to Serenity's birth certificate and their lease agreement and all the other papers that documented their legal existence as a family of two. That night, as she tucked Serenity into the toddler bed they'd picked out together, she felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving the mansion: complete and utter peace. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but entirely their own, built on the foundation of choices made from love rather than fear. "Sweet dreams. Beautiful girl," she whispered, kissing Serenity's forehead. "Tomorrow we'll keep building our life together." Outside their window, the city hummed with the quiet energy of people pursuing their own versions of happiness and success. But inside their small apartment, Zephyra Nightingale had already found both. The woman in the mirror was someone she barely recognized from her days as Hannah's wife. Stronger, more confident, utterly self-possessed. She had built a life with her own hands, raised a daughter who knew only unconditional love, and proved that happiness didn't require luxury to flourish. As she prepared for bed, Zephyra thought about the future she was building for Serenity. A future where worth wasn't measured by bank accounts or social standing, but by kindness and strength and the courage to choose what was right over what was easy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that they could thrive on their own terms. But tonight, in their small apartment filled with love and laughter and the simple joy of being together, they had everything they needed. Chapter 10. The Final Truth. Justice isn't always about what the law allows. Sometimes it's about what the heart can bear and what the soul can forgive. The courthouse steps gleamed wet with morning rain as Zephyra climbed them for what she hoped would be the final time. Time had passed since Serenity's birth, and despite the signed termination papers, Hannah had found a legal loophole, a technicality in the documentation that his expensive attorneys had exploited to petition for supervised visitation rights. Now, on this grey morning that matched her mood, she would face him one last time in front of a judge who would decide their family's future. Celeste walked beside her, providing the silent support that had become invaluable during the months of legal preparation. Serenity skipped between them, her small hand warm in Zephyr's, chattering about the ducks they'd seen in the courthouse fountain. Her daughter was all curiosity and energy, completely unaware that her entire future hung in the balance of whatever decision would be made in the next few hours. "Mama, why do we have to go to the big building?" Serenity asked as they passed through the metal detectors that marked the entrance to a world of legal battles and binding decisions, because sometimes grown-ups have to let other grown-ups help them figure out important things, Zephyrah said carefully. She'd spent weeks preparing for this day, but no amount of preparation could ease the knot of anxiety that had taken permanent residence in her chest. The family court waiting area was a study in institutional beige, filled with uncomfortable chairs and the quiet desperation of people whose most intimate relationships had become matters of public record. Zephyrah settled into a seat near the window, Serenity immediately climbing into her lap with the easy confidence of a child who had never doubted her welcome anywhere. Mrs. Nightingale, a young woman in a crisp suit, approached with a manila folder and the brisk efficiency of someone who dealt with family trauma as a matter of professional routine. "I'm Rebecca Davis, the court-appointed advocate for your daughter. I wanted to speak with you briefly before we go in." Zephyrah had been dreading this conversation, the clinical evaluation of her fitness as a mother, the scrutiny of their small but happy life, the possibility that a stranger's assessment could override everything she'd built through love and determination. "How is Serenity handling all of this?" Rebecca asked, settling into the adjacent chair while keeping her voice low enough that curious ears couldn't overhear. "She doesn't know what's happening," Zephyrah said honestly. "I've tried to keep her routine as normal as possible. She's never met her father, never asked about him. In her world, families are just mothers and children and the people who care about them." Rebecca made notes on her clipboard, her expression carefully neutral. "And how would you feel about court-ordered visitation? If the judge determines that contact with her biological father would be in Serenity's best interest?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended over everything Zephyrah had worked to protect. She looked down at her daughter, who was now drawing pictures on the back of a legal document with a crayon Rebecca had provided, completely absorbed in creating something beautiful from blank space. "I would comply with whatever the court orders," Zephyrah said carefully. "But I want it on record that I believe exposing her to someone who abandoned her before birth will do more harm than good." "Noted," Rebecca said. "And just so you're prepared, Mr. Christian's attorney is likely to argue that he was overwhelmed when he made his initial decision, that he's matured and wants to be part of his daughter's life now." "Mr. Christian was a grown man when he threw me out," Zephyrah replied evenly. "Old enough to understand the consequences of his choices. Being overwhelmed doesn't excuse cruelty." Before Rebecca could respond, a bailiff appeared in the doorway. Nightingale versus Christian, Judge Harrison presiding. Courtroom 3. The courtroom was smaller than Zephyrah had expected, but somehow that made it more intimidating rather than less. Every seat was filled with observers. Reporters who had caught wind of the story, curious court watchers drawn by the drama of wealth and abandonment, and a surprising number of women who looked like they might be there to show solidarity with a single mother fighting to protect her child. Hannah sat at the plaintiff's table with two attorneys who probably cost more per hour than Zephyrah made in a week. He looked older, more worn than when she'd seen him at the coffee shop, as if the legal battle had aged him in ways his previous losses hadn't. When their eyes met across the courtroom, she saw something she'd never seen in him before. Genuine fear, Judge Harrison was a woman with silver hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every excuse and seen every variation of human failure that family court could offer. She reviewed the case files with methodical precision before addressing the room. This case involves a petition for supervised visitation rights by the biological father of a minor child, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that would reshape lives. The child has had no contact with the petitioner since birth. The mother terminated the father's parental rights through legal documentation, but the petitioner is challenging the validity of that termination. The legal proceedings that followed were a careful dance of evidence and testimony that reduced their relationship to a series of documented facts. Anna's attorney painted a picture of a man who had panicked when faced with unexpected responsibility, but had since grown into someone ready to embrace fatherhood. They presented evidence of his financial stability, his lack of criminal record, his completion of parenting classes that he'd taken voluntarily. Zephyr's attorney countered with the timeline of abandonment. How? Anna had not only rejected the pregnancy, but demanded she choose between the child and their marriage. How he'd provided no support during pregnancy or after birth. How he'd had no contact with Serenity until she was walking. They presented photos of Zephyra working while pregnant, medical records showing she'd attended every prenatal appointment alone, documentation of the financial struggle she'd endured while building a stable life for her daughter. Your Honor, Hannah's attorney said during his closing argument, my client acknowledges that he made mistakes early in this process, but he's asking for the chance to build a relationship with his biological daughter under whatever supervision the court deems appropriate. Denying him that opportunity would deprive both father and child of a meaningful connection. Your Honor, Zephyr's attorney responded, my client has created a stable, loving environment for her daughter without any contribution from the biological father, introducing a man who has already demonstrated his willingness to abandon. This child, when circumstances become difficult, serves no one's best interest except his own. When the attorneys finished their arguments, Judge Harrison turned her attention directly to Zephyra. Mrs. Nightingale, I'd like to hear from you directly. You understand that this court generally believes children benefit from relationships with both biological parents when those relationships can be maintained safely. Zephyra stood slowly, feeling the weight of every person in the courtroom focused on her words. She thought of all the nights she'd worked while pregnant, all the moments of joy she'd experienced alone with Serenity, all the times she'd been both mother and father because no one else had been willing to share the responsibility. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, I understand the court's position, and I want to be clear that I don't oppose Mr. Christian having contact with our daughter out of spite or anger. She paused, looking directly at Hannah for the first time since entering the courtroom. I oppose it because I've spent her entire life protecting Serenity from disappointment and abandonment. Because I've built her entire sense of security around knowing that the people in her life chose to be there, not because a court ordered them to be there. But Mrs. Nightingale, Judge Harrison said gently, don't you think children have a right to know their biological parents? I think children have a right to be wanted, Zephyra replied, her voice growing stronger. They have a right to stability, to consistency, to knowing that the adults in their lives will be there through difficulties as well as celebrations. Mr. Christian has demonstrated that he cannot provide those things. People can change, the judge observed. Yes, they can, Zephyra agreed. But change doesn't erase consequences. And consequences don't disappear just because someone regrets their choices. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrison considered the arguments she'd heard. Serenity, who had been quietly coloring in the front row with Celeste, looked up at the sound of her mother's voice and waved cheerfully. The simple gesture, so innocent and trusting, seemed to crystallize everything at stake in this legal battle. After reviewing all the evidence and testimony, Judge Harrison said finally, I'm prepared to make my ruling." Zephyra felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the judge continued. "Mr. Christian, you have established your biological paternity, and the court recognizes that biological parents generally have rights to maintain relationships with their children. However, this court is also bound to consider the best interests of the child above all other considerations." Hannah leaned forward in his chair, hope and desperation warring in his expression. "Therefore, I am granting limited, supervised visitation rights to Mr. Christian, 1 hour per month, in a neutral location, with a court-appointed supervisor present. These visits will be subject to review and can be terminated immediately if they prove detrimental to the child's well-being." Zephyra felt the world tilt slightly, but she remained standing, her spine straight and her dignity intact. She had known this was a possibility. Her attorney had prepared her for the likelihood that biological rights would trump emotional arguments. "However," Judge Harrison continued, and something in her tone made everyone in the courtroom lean forward, "I want to address something that has become clear during these proceedings. Mrs. Nightingale, you have created a remarkable life for your daughter under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. You have provided stability, love, and security without any support from the biological father. That dedication doesn't go unnoticed by this court." The judge turned her attention to Hannah, and her expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Christian, you are being granted an opportunity that many biological fathers in your situation would not receive. You abandoned your pregnant wife and had no contact with your child for her entire life. The only reason you're being given visitation rights is because this court believes in the possibility of redemption, but those rights come with responsibilities." Hannah nodded eagerly, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "These visits are not about your convenience or your schedule or your desire for redemption. They are about what is best for Serenity. If you miss appointments, if you create drama, if you do anything that disrupts the stability her mother has built, these rights will be terminated permanently. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Hannah said, his voice barely above a whisper. Judge Harrison's gavel fell with finality, and the courtroom erupted in quiet conversation as people processed the decision. Zephyra remained standing for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. She had lost the legal battle, but somehow she didn't feel defeated. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Hannah approached her cautiously, his expression a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "Zephyra," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I understand the gift you're giving me. I won't waste it." She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. He was older, humbler, worn down by losses that money couldn't restore. But he was also still the man who had chosen his own convenience over his family's well-being when it mattered most. "This isn't a gift," she said calmly. "This is a court order. And just so we're clear, you can see her for 1 hour a month in a supervised setting. But you will never be her hero. You will never be the parent she turns to when she's scared or hurt or needs comfort. That role belongs to the woman who chose her when no one else would." The words hung between them with absolute finality. Hannah had won his legal case, but they both knew he had lost something infinitely more valuable, the chance to be truly necessary in his daughter's life. As Zephyra walked away, head held high with Serenity's hand clasped firmly in hers, she carried with her the greatest victory of all. She had saved herself, built a life worth living, and raised a daughter who would never question her own worth. The court could mandate visits, but it couldn't manufacture love. It couldn't create the bond that forms between a parent and child through days of showing up, regardless of convenience or personal cost. Outside the courthouse, as they walked toward their car in the gentle rain, Serenity looked up at her mother with the complete trust that came from never having been disappointed by the person who mattered most. "Mama, are we going home now?" "Yes, baby girl," Zephyra said, lifting her daughter into her arms. "We're going home." Home, their small apartment above the coffee shop. Their life built on love rather than obligation. Their future that belonged entirely to them, court orders notwithstanding. As they drove away from the courthouse, Zephyra caught sight of Hannah in her rearview mirror, standing alone on the steps in the rain. Watching them disappear into a life he would forever remain peripheral to. He had fought for the legal right to see his daughter, but he would never have what she had, Serenity's complete and unconditional love. And that, Zephyra knew, was justice of the truest kind.